All right, everybody, going live another new way this week. So appreciate if you would drop in the comments if you can hear fine and all those types of things. But we are going live now in this new way, and I believe it's still working. Just got a new setup here that I'm trying out. Okay, so today we're continuing on in our third lesson on how to handle money using this little booklet by Chris Wright as kind of the launching pad, as we've been talking about in our Tuesday tips about principles and financial tips for ministries and for ministers specifically in nonprofit type of environments. So this third lesson, and again, this whole little booklet is rooted in Paul's teaching on finances to the Corinthian church in 1st and 2nd Corinthians chapter 9 primarily, but also today, 1st Corinthians chapter 16. And the lesson we're going to look at today in our few minutes together is that financial appeals require advanced planning. And the couple of pages devoted to this lesson in the booklet I find very, very helpful. And I'll probably share a couple of little stories from time in pastoring and ministry situations as well, which I think adds another layer to understanding how this works its way out and how applicable what Paul says is. Now, first of all, in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 3, Paul says this. Now, about the collection for God's people, do what I told the Galatian churches to do. So this is, a regional-wide, multiple churches all over the place contributing to this collection. On the first day of the week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income, saving it up, so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Then when I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men you approve and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. Now, there's a lot of details in what Paul says right there that we may miss if we're not careful. First of all, Paul is showing preparedness. He's given instruction to the churches in Galatia. He's giving instruction now to the churches in Corinth, to the church in Corinth, and he is encouraging them to make preparations for this offering. Begin to save up. Do it every week. And so it's fairly safe to assume, I believe there, that Paul is talking about your weekly income, your weekly wages, and probably this is probably taking place at the Sunday gathering, at the worship of the church on a regular purpose. It certainly gives us a pattern for regular giving that we would see down to the present day. There's also things here that, well, I'll dive into that in a moment. I also believe that Paul is very clear that he is encouraging them to do this to reinforce what he says in 1st and 2nd Corinthians chapter 9, which is Paul wants them to give generously, to give willingly, not to be giving grudgingly. And the booklet makes that point as well. When Paul is talking about giving and teaching the Corinthian church about this in regard to taking up the collection for the relief of the very hard time that the Jewish believers are going through back in the Holy Land, he is encouraging them to do so willingly. He's not trying to force them or begrudge them or coerce them, but to give them the opportunity. And we looked at last time how another church gave even out of its poverty. They didn't have very much. They weren't rich people, and yet they wanted to give and to help their brothers and sisters in another part of the world that were struggling, and they did so. So everybody, the little booklet here says, is urged to put their hands in their pockets. I kind of like that illustration. Everybody can give something. It may not be a lot, but then I want to highlight the way that the booklet breaks this down. And if I was preaching through this passage and expositing it as a pastor, and I actually did when I was teaching through the Corinthian letters, I taught through some passages like this, particularly where Paul is giving instructions about giving and about how to handle finances. And so I would break it down in a very similar way, and I have from the pulpit. But what is Paul saying in his instruction there in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 through 3? He's saying that it should be systematic giving. Okay? They're planning on how they're going to give, on when they're going to give. It's regular. Week by week, they're setting aside money, they're saving it up. It is also proportionate. It's according to your income. If you have more income, then it's very simple. You can give more. If you have less income, or you have an income in which expenses or needs are eating up a large portion of that, let's say a medical condition or something, then your ability to give is lessened. It's proportional to your income and proportional to what you have available. That makes sense. That's just logical, and that is common sense. Okay, Paul does not say give and you're going to get a blessing. He doesn't do what the televangelist quacks do of saying give a certain amount and God's going to multiply and give back. He doesn't do that at all. He encourages the people to give systematically, regularly, and proportionally, and they're going to give generously and willingly. And then he also lays out several things, and I love the way that it's put here. The means of collecting should be transparent. The brothers who are going to come, they're going to be selected, they're going to oversee the giving. The total collected should be made public. It's announced, it's recorded, and all of it is going to have preparation and supervision by the Apostle Paul's careful planning. He talks about how he's going to give a letter along with these men to endorse them. The church is going to select representatives from among themselves, and that they should be keeping records, essentially, is what he's talking about. And the whole point of the lesson, again, is that financial appeals require advanced planning. Paul didn't show up on their doorstep and say, give a bunch of money, there's a need here. He sets things in motion. He sends instruction ahead of time. He's talked about Titus, I believe it was, in our last lesson, and about Titus being involved in some things. And he calls the church not only to every individual member in every household to be saving up and setting aside proportionally and regularly and saving for this offering, doing what they can so that he doesn't have to take a collection when he comes. So it's not pressure. It's not, let's hurry up and get this done, but it's already been being done. And he encourages them to select representatives, which is how a lot of churches function. When I pastored, we were in a congregational form of government of the church. It's very common that you elect officers. There's other types of churches that operate more on boards or different things. But the bottom line is somehow people are appointed many times to managing finances, or sometimes the church has an outside firm that manages like the payment of bills or something, or a staff person, a financial administrator or accountant or something like that, a church treasurer. But the bottom line is nonprofits of any stripe, even if they're not churches, you got to manage the finances. And somebody's responsibility, some group of people's responsibility falls with that. It may fall more on a board, it may fall more on particular people or even staff people, but the bottom line is that people are appointed and set apart for that work. And a key part of accountability when it comes to finances is having layers of protection. Okay, Paul is very involved in administrating, getting this put together. That was our last lesson, actually, last time, as we saw that administration is an act of stewardship, of being gracious and obedient. It's both, administering freely and giving, showing the Lord's grace, but also obediently to live out the faith that we have received. We're not saved by our acts of faith, but our acts of faith flow from our belief, our faith in the Lord. It flows out as a fruit. It is a result. But there's a lot of elements in which nonprofits should be very careful. There should be layers of accountability. Again, Paul lays this out long before there's all the laws and practices there are today, but it's the same basic principles that undergird how ministries should operate. Okay, notice that Paul himself is not handling the money, right? He's actually going to be endorsing, so to speak, their representatives. He's making the appeal and setting the case. He's casting the vision, if you want to use that term, for what the money is going to be used for, what the purpose of collecting the funds is, and he lays out some goals. That is the role of a senior leader or of an executive or a fundraising type of role. There is a role of that, of being clear, and it requires that planning and that appeal. He's making an appeal, and it requires this advanced planning. But the means in which it's going to be collected is transparent. People are going to be selected, and there's going to be a letter of, endorsement, of certification for them. The total that's collected should be made public. Now, that's something you see over in the book of Ezra. Ezra picks different people, and they're carrying back different things in the rebuilding of the temple and in the resettling of going back from captivity to Jerusalem in particular and to the Holy Land after they have been ousted. And they write it down, and there's books of accounting in Ezra where, okay, so-and-so is in charge of carrying like this much gold or this particular item, and it's all public, it's a record. There is a place for all of those little details that we might not sometimes want. And even if that's not your thing to be super detailed, this has a purpose. The gift of administration and detail has a purpose because it also provides accountability and protection for the folks handling these things. So if you have people counting the money, like there was one time before I was a pastor, I was a church member. I was in seminary at the time, but I was not a pastor. And I was on a team. I was part of the team that would help usher and collect and count the funds. And we had a process and the group of people that would do it, and we compare the numbers, and we'd sign off. And there were all these steps of accountability and protection. When I became a pastor, I carried over the lessons I had learned into pastoring of, hey, it shouldn't just be one person handling all the money. There should be a team involved. And getting a financial team in place was actually a key part of leadership process, of getting a team that would be involved in financial stewardship, and then of course how we would bring that in our reporting in our church business meetings and reporting that in our annual budget. It gave the grounds for an appeal. We show the church, here's the categories, broadly here's what we expect to be budgeted for, like electricity over the year. And we could break operational expenses versus things we want to do, aspirational things, giving we want to do, and it provided a basis for the appeal. We also increased giving, and we had a team involved, and all of the aspects were able to be done in such a way that it was all ministry, and it was all transparent, and it was much better to be doing things that way. So again, Paul has this hat of casting the vision. He's able to say, hey, here's what we're planning, and there's not surprises, there's not gimmicks, there's not pressure, there's not coercion, there's no manipulation. And the booklet even makes that point. And I love that, because within the church, that should not be present, and really within any nonprofit. You're going to be turning people off, and you're not really doing ministry the way it's intended if you're emotionally manipulating people and trying to force them to give. That's not being a servant and ministering to the very people that are supporting the work, and perhaps even a salary if you are a minister or a person on staff of a nonprofit. So I really love the fact that this talks about and sets the basis for us of how proper planning is needed. And so even if you're a pastor, again, I strongly would encourage, if you're a pastor or executive director or whatever of a nonprofit, don't manage the finances yourself. I realize that sometimes there are very small nonprofits that don't have like a lot of staff people and stuff, but as much as you can, have a board, have people involved, have layers of accountability here. Another simple thing you can do, it's not mentioned, I don't believe, in the little lesson here in the booklet, and it wasn't around back then, most likely, but to pay an accounting firm or a CPA to do an audit. Do an audit of your church books, do an audit of your ministry books. You do that every year, every couple years. It's another layer of accountability that everything's being looked at. And hey, people do make mistakes. If a penny was lost here or 10 cents, or having a second set of eyes and paying the amount of money is usually not a crazy amount of money if your books are fairly simple. And being able to have that is just another layer of accountability. Again, a public audit of ministry funds. Big ministries with lots and lots of funds, they do this. And you can do it. It can look a little different, and the way the audit's conducted may be a little different, but it's a layer of accountability as well. I think it's a great practice for local churches. Again, it's another layer to also have accountability and protection for your volunteers, just as important for them. From a more practical perspective as well, your church or your nonprofit insurance package very likely may have something for errors and omissions, or something for if like some funds are stolen or something like that. There very well may be some coverage, or some coverage that you could add. Again, if you don't have layers of accountability here, and if you don't have layers of planning, then you open up the board for embezzlement's a whole lot easier if you don't have layers of accountability. Not accusing anybody of that, just it's much easier to happen and much more likely to happen if there's not layers of accountability, some boundaries and guardrails. Secondly, it's a lot easier to be relying on emotional manipulation or coercion or pressure or emotional appeals if you don't have a financial appeal planned. I do realize that things do arise in which there may not have been a way to plan for it, like church building gets wiped out by a tornado. Probably weren't ready for that. Now you hopefully have insurance that was proactive and different things in the event of something like that happening. But for the regular appeals, the regular budget, for common giving and for missions giving, have a plan. It's the basis of your appeal. One thing we were able to do, even teaching this to kids, is that in VBS we were able to have a challenge where we'd have boys versus girls in their giving and that type of thing. But we were able to pick a missions project for the year or a missions partner. And we raised money specifically for that. So that was a helpful thing. Again, the more communication and the more clarity, the better basis you have. That's really the whole point of what Paul is doing. And I think there's a lot of solid principles here we can learn from really just a few verses at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 16. God bless you. Hope that this was an encouragement or help to you. If I can help more or help kind of coach you or answer some questions about just as you're maybe thinking about some of the stuff, again, I'm not going to manage anything for you, but as a financial coach, I'm able to kind of step back with an outside set of eyes and say, hey, here's maybe some best practices to consider or some ideas to think about. And if you are a minister, a pastor in the revitalization space, or a small nonprofit and finances are a struggle, like maybe you're not operating on a budget, hey, I got some great tips. I've actually walked organizations through that in previous roles I've had, and so I would love to be an encouragement to you and help. Just feel free to reach out. God bless.